What's up, guys? So, the term lineal has become very controversial, particularly on Twitter recently, and boxing Twitter is becoming crazier by the day. But Tyson Fury is fighting Otto Wallin this weekend in Las Vegas. And if you listen to ESPN, to their promos, if you go to their social, if you go to their website, you are being told that this fight, Fury-Wallin, is for the heavyweight championship of the world. Now, to be clear, Fury's promoters are Frank Warren over in the UK and Bob Arum, Top Rank here in the USA, but he fights on ESPN. So they are essentially a quasi-promoter, right? And they're trying to build up to this eventual rematch with Deontay Wilder next year, and they want to make that seem bigger and badder. And part of that is this lineal message. You're going to hear the word lineal about 400 times in the broadcast this weekend. And you're probably going to get some vignette with Mark Kriegel talking about Tyson Fury's history with mental illness and how courageous he is to come back from the brink. And to be clear, Tyson Fury does deserve credit for not only truly coming back from the brink, but bringing awareness to mental illness and making it okay for boxers and other martial artists, tough guys, quote unquote, to talk about this stuff in an honest and open, comfortable way. He does deserve credit for that. But you're going to hear ESPN talk about all that stuff and talk about the lineage, and they're not going to talk about any of the dark side, the bad things that were going on during Tyson Fury's absence from the ring and just before that fight with Wladimir Klitschko. So my position on this whole thing is that Tyson Fury is not the lineal champion. He briefly was, but he gave that up. And there are people online, whether they be Tyson Fury fans or some of his defenders, colleagues, if you will, in the media, they're trying to spin certain narratives without providing full details. They're kind of glancing over certain things, just like ESPN, Top Rank, and Queensberry are doing. And I feel it my duty to explain everything and provide nuance, provide detail, because that kind of stuff matters. So right now, The Ring Magazine and Boxing Monthly Magazine, two publications I write for, full disclosure, rate Tyson Fury #1. And I have no beef with that. If you rate Tyson Fury as the #1 heavyweight in the world, I got no beef with that. You could absolutely make a case. I mean, in terms of rounds, he beat Deontay Wilder last year. Without those two knockdowns, Tyson Fury wins that decision, and he'd have the WBC title right now. And of course, Anthony Joshua was seen as the #1 guy, but he lost to Andy Ruiz, and that rematch isn't until December. We don't know how that's going to play out. So, as it stands right now, Tyson Fury is the #1 in a division, pretty much universally. And a lot of people see Deontay Wilder #2 in the division. So if and when they fight next year, if it's the same, if they're both still #1 and #2 and they fight each other in the rematch, the winner of that fight very well could be seen as the new lineal champion, because you'd have a #1 and a #2 fighting each other. That's fine. That's not what took place when the two of them fought last year, okay? And to be clear, the lineal champion, the purists, the old timers, they talk about the man who beat the man who beat the man, okay? Sometimes the man retires and that lineage is broken. In the case with Lennox Lewis, he retired. He was the man, he retired. So a new lineage had to be established. And when Wladimir Klitschko, who I've got his resume up here, when Wladimir Klitschko, let's see, I'm just going to briefly go over some of his career highlights, his title reign. He beat Sam Peter, undefeated Sam Peter in 2005, beats Chris Bird in 2006, who was rated #1 at the time by several publications, I believe, including ESPN at the time. Beats him in 2006, rematch with Layman Brewster in 2007, wins that. Unifies titles with Sultan Ibragimov in 2008, beats former lineal champion Hasim Rahman in 2008, beats Ruslan Shagayev in 2009, and at that time, The Ring Magazine stepped in and said, okay, new lineage established. We've got, I believe at that time it was #1 versus #2. It may have been #1 versus #3 in the division. We're going to go ahead and say new lineage established here. We've got two guys who are undefeated, highly accomplished, both as amateurs and pros. I believe Shagayev went to the Olympics. I believe he medaled as well. We, of course, know Klitschko did gold medal in Atlanta in 1996. So, boom, new lineage, 2009. Beats Sam Peter again, 2010. Beats David Haye in 2011, who at the time was seen as the top-rated contender. So once again, you had a number 1 versus number 2 situation, or champion versus number 2 situation. Later on, let's see, beats Alexander Povetkin in 2013, and at that time, Alexander Povetkin was seen as the top contender. Beats him. Beats Kubrat Pulev in 2014, who is still, to this day, rated as a top 10 heavyweight. Beats Bryant Jennings in 2015, who's right around there. And then, of course, loses to Tyson Fury in 2015. So, why do I bring all that up? To establish that Wladimir Klitschko, not just off one fight, but over a series of fights, over a series of years, had separated himself as the man in the division. There was no debate. He was the guy. His accomplishments over a series of years, basically over a decade, spoke for themselves. It didn't matter that he wasn't able to beat the man, Lennox Lewis, because Lennox Lewis retired. And he couldn't just go into a bar and try to talk him into a fight. He had established himself as the guy. And my argument right now is that yes, Tyson Fury did beat Wladimir Klitschko in November of 2015 with a massive asterisk over it, which I'll get into in just a second. But he hasn't established himself as the man. He hasn't separated himself from the pack. He hasn't distinguished himself as the guy. He's basically getting by and promoting himself. And it's not him, it's his handlers doing this. I have no issue with Tyson Fury. They are promoting him and building him up off of one fight. One fight 4 years ago under a cloud of suspicion. That's not how it's done. You base a fighter off the totality of his work. And right now, Fury, Wilder, Ruiz, Joshua, and everyone else, no one's distinguished themselves as the guy. It's a wide open division. Some guys have one title, some guys have multiple titles. Some guys don't even have a title right now. Don't pay attention to the damn titles because that's all politics. Wladimir Klitschko could never get the WBC title because his brother had it for a while, but then Don King had it when Berman Stavern held it, and he had a beef with the Klitschkos going back years. He wasn't going to work with Wladimir. Of course, Wladimir would have pulverized Stavern. Don King sold that title to Al Heyman and Deontay Wilder. And Al Heyman wasn't going to work with Klitschko. Klitschko would have pulverized that version of Deontay Wilder back then. So it's politics that kept him from having the WBC title. Lennox Lewis never got the WBO title. Does anyone doubt Lennox Lewis was the man? And it wasn't just off one fight or one win. It wasn't just off, let's say, the Holyfield win or anything like that. It was over a series of wins. Lennox Lewis proved himself to be the man, right? That hasn't happened right now. But real quick, I want to go back to 2015 because there's a timeline there that you guys, a lot of you out there are either not aware of or you're just glancing over it on purpose. This stuff matters, okay? He fights Wladimir Klitschko November 28, 2015, wins the title, the championship of the heavyweight division. Forget about the WBC. He was the man right there. However, there was things that happened before that fight that need to be discussed. And it's why I put an asterisk over that win for Fury. Earlier that year, February 28th, so literally 9 months before, he fought Christian Hammer in Greenwich, O2 Arena. So UCAD, UK Anti-Doping, collects samples from him both before that fight in February, or maybe it was the night of the fight, I can't remember off the top of my head, don't quote me, but one in February and then one after in March. Collects 2 samples, 2 different months. Tests them. Both test positive for nandrolone. Now, I'm not going to do an hour-long video discussing nandrolone, but basically it's a synthetic, it's a steroid, it's an anabolic. And bodybuilders have used it for years. It puts on lean muscle, which helps burn fat, of course, helps you lean out, helps you cut up, helps you build up strength. So there's a lot of different things that it does. Look it up, nandrolone. Test positive twice. Is brought into a hearing by UCAD in September. So, samples collected February, March, test positive. Brought into a room in September, made aware of the test. UCAD and the BBBFC, the British Commission, Do they tell the IBF, who had mandated Tyson Fury as their mandatory? No. Do they tell Wladimir Klitschko, who is about to fight Tyson Fury? No. Do they tell the media, the public, the fans? No. Tyson Fury knew, his promotion knew, his entire team knew. UKAD knew, BBBFC knew. The entire world, no one else knew. You'd have to think that if the IBF knew Tyson Fury had taken steroids, they would have stripped him of his mandatory position. This sort of thing has happened in the past. I can cite all kinds of examples. You'd also have to think that if Wladimir Klitschko knew his mandatory had taken steroids, he'd either refuse to fight him or he'd make sure, he'd demand that they do VADA testing before the fight. And I'm not talking about VADA, clean boxing program, or maybe you're being tested once a month or something like that. I'm talking about multiple tests a week, sometimes multiple samples collected in a day. I'm talking about blood, urine, the CIR test, everything, okay? He would have demanded that. And in fact, he demanded it for the rematch, which I'll get to in a second. So, you have a guy who ingested steroids months before his fight for the heavyweight championship. UKAD didn't make anybody aware. By the way, UKAD's adjudication process is terrible. It's the worst in the sport. It's a complete joke. It actually makes USADA look legit. It needs to be fixed. This is just one example, this Tyson Fury, Wladimir Klitschko situation, but we can bring up a recent example that's still ongoing with Dillian Whyte. Hey, where's that B sample with Dillian Whyte? Anyone hear about that B sample yet? Anyone hear from UKAD about what's going on with Dillian Whyte? No. UKAD's process, and they're a government agency over there in the UK, their process sucks. And it has screwed over fighters and fans too many times. It needs to be fixed. The British boxing authorities need to get on that, and the fans and the media, especially over there, who are afraid to lose their press credential, need to step up and have some balls and demand that be changed, because that process is awful. That rant's over. Okay, so November 28th, Tyson Fury beats Wladimir Klitschko. Subsequently, it finally comes out that Fury took steroids. UKAD makes the public aware. Wladimir Klitschko now knows. He's pretty pissed off, which is, not hard to imagine. He demands VADA for the rematch. Tyson Fury can't do anything about it. He can't say, no, we're not doing VADA, because the rematch was contractually mandated from the Klitschko side. There was a rematch clause in that first fight. So Klitschko says VADA, Fury's got to do VADA. So he signs on to do VADA, knowing that he's currently being tested, literally giving samples, blood, urine, doing coke. So in other words, if I'm playing amateur psychiatrist here, that seems like purposeful self-sabotage. That's just the way that reads to me, not wanting any of that rematch. And I believe at one point it was pushed back or delayed because of a quote-unquote ankle injury or something like that. I can't remember the exact dates, but I believe it was supposed to take place in late 2016, maybe October 2016. Ultimately, the rematch gets scrapped and Tyson Fury, quote-unquote, retires. He retires at that point. He was basically going to face a suspension. He's unlicensed for a period of time. I do believe there was kind of a later suspension for the positive nandrolone test at one point that served in between 2015 and 2018. During that time, and it's been much talked about, he balloons up in weight, there's the cocaine use, the alcohol abuse, all these other things. Who knows what other drugs were involved, what was going on, but he wasn't fighting. And at one point, the Ring Magazine, and I serve on the Ring Ratings Committee. I serve on the committee with Boxing Monthly as well. But at Ring Magazine, Fury did hold the Ring Magazine Heavyweight Championship. We gave him an ultimatum. Announce a fight by this date or we're stripping you. He didn't announce a fight, we stripped him. So at that point, we stopped recognizing him as champion. He comes back after 2.5 years plus outside the ring and fights Sefer Safari, which, look, for a comeback opponent, who cares, right? He doesn't have to fight a top guy coming back. But let's be clear. Safari, I believe, was a cruiserweight, is not even a top 100 heavyweight. beats him, then fights an ancient Francesco Pianetta, who at his best was a decent gatekeeper level heavyweight, but at this point was old, softened up, several losses. In fact, he came into the fight with Fury having lost 2 of his last 3. And then, of course, there's the fight with Wilder, which ends in a draw. And then since he's fought Tom Schwartz and now Otto Wallen this weekend, 2 guys who aren't even top 20 heavyweights. Given everything that I just described that took place before the fight with Klitschko and after the fight with Klitschko, the calendar year before the fight with Klitschko, in the 4 years since, how the hell can you say that this guy is the heavyweight champion? Shame on ESPN and everybody else involved, including Frank Warren and Bob Arum, for promoting this guy as the champion. And this isn't me hating on the guy or me having it in for him. It's just telling the truth. He is, again, if you rate him as the top heavyweight right now, I got no problem with that. No criticism at all. You could certainly make that case. But the champion? No. Comparing him to what Wladimir Klitschko did over a decade, what Lennox Lewis did over a series of years, what Evander Holyfield did, what Mike Tyson did, what Larry Holmes did, going all the way back. I've heard people comparing Tyson Fury's absence from the ring to Muhammad Ali's. How unbelievably disgusting and quite frankly prejudiced of you to even put those two in the same sentence. Muhammad Ali wasn't allowed to fight because he refused to go to war for this country. He had a principle that he stood upon, a moral, ethical principle. That's why he didn't fight. Tyson Fury didn't fight because he, again, I think purposeful self-sabotage, wanted no part of a fully focused Wladimir Klitschko without steroids. That's just my personal opinion based upon everything we've seen. But that's why he didn't fight. It's because he gained over 10 stone and was getting stoned for 2.5 years. That's why he didn't fight. People have compared it to when Joe Louis didn't defend his championship for a few years. Joe Louis was honorably serving in our country's military. You're comparing that to Tyson Fury's absence? Even Dempsey's absence. There's nuance there that differs vastly from what took place here. Or James Braddock and other. You're comparing completely different eras and timelines to this. It's disgusting. Stop it. This is a completely different era in completely different circumstances. Okay? So where are we at right now as it stands? We've got Fury, Joshua, Ruiz, and Wilder in some up-and-coming contenders that are right there. And each guy can make a claim to being the top guy in the division. Just a few months ago, it was Anthony Joshua before he fought Andy Ruiz. But neither guy, none of them, has distinguished and separated themselves as the guy. And that's the only argument I'm making here. Now, I should be clear. If and when Fury and Wilder fight, if they're still rated number 1 and number 2, as they are right now, Ring Magazine, Boxing Monthly, rate those two as the number 1 and number 2 fighters in the division. If they still are, next year when they fight a rematch, then you know what? The winner of that fight's the new guy. Because that's a number 1 versus number 2. So this whole debate might be all for naught. If early next year, Fury and Wilder fight again, and Fury definitively defeats Wilder, he actually steps up the offense here and throws more than a few hundred punches and beats Wilder, then guess what? If they're both rated number 1 and number 2 at that time, then you got a new champion. You really, really do. But we don't know if that's going to be the case. We don't know what's going to happen in December in Saudi Arabia between Joshua and Ruiz and how that might affect the ratings. That might change things. It really, really might. But one quick note that I forgot to bring up a second ago, because I think this matters as it relates to Nandrolone. Tyson Fury weighed 247 pounds against Wladimir Klitschko. In his fight against Hammer earlier that year, he weighed 260. Against Chisora, 264. Against Abel, 274. Before that, against Steve Cunningham, 254. You have to go all the way back to mid-2012 to find a fight where he weighed less than he did against Wladimir Klitschko. He hasn't been as light as 247 since. Now, a lot of you will say, well, that's because he's been inactive. Well, that's not necessarily true. He weighed 256 against Wilder. He was heavier, 263 against Schwartz. So in other words, in the last 7+ years, it just so happened that leading up to that Wladimir Klitschko fight, he was the most lean and ripped he's ever been. Just so happened to test positive for nandrolone that year. Just going to leave that out there. Again, it's part of the reason why I put an asterisk over that W. Doesn't change the fact that he got the W, but there's, again, nuance. There's subtext to that context that should be described. And that is why right now I don't rate Tyson Fury as the lineal champion. I think that lineage has been broken. I think when he fought Deontay Wilder last December, that wasn't the number 1 versus number 2 fighters in the division. At that time, Anthony Joshua was number 1, and many people rated Wilder number 2, but Tyson Fury wasn't even rated in the top 10 at that point. Maybe he was, but he didn't deserve it. He had fought Safari and Pineda going into that fight against Wilder. So clearly, that wasn't the top 2 heavyweights at the time that were fighting. That was not a fight for the lineal heavyweight championship. And I don't give a shit how Jimmy Lennon on that Showtime broadcast announced the fighters. He announced Deontay Wilder as the WBC champion, Tyson Fury as the lineal champion. I don't give a shit how he announces the fighters, how Michael Buffer announces them, how anyone else announces them, or what the promoters call them, or what the sanctioning organizations have to say. We clearly know when a fighter is the guy, whether they win all 4 titles or not. Alexander Usyk was the guy at cruiserweight, right? It just so happened that he won all the titles. He was able to do that. Politically, that's very hard to do now because of the networks, the promoters, the politics. But we've seen champions in the past that maybe had 2, 3 of the 4 titles that were still seen as the guy, clearly the guy. A recent example would be Gennady Golovkin at middleweight, and then now Canelo Alvarez. Gennady Golovkin didn't have all 4 of the middleweight titles, but he clearly was the guy. He was the champion. He was the best fighter. He had distinguished and separated himself as the top middleweight in the world. And when Canelo Alvarez beat him last year, regardless of who you feel won that fight, officially it was Canelo, he became the guy. Right now, Canelo Alvarez is the middleweight champion. Demetrius Andrade has a title. He's not the guy. He has a title. Canelo Alvarez is the guy. You see the difference? That's what I'm talking about here, people. Big difference between a titleist and a champion. And right now, there is no heavyweight champion. End of discussion, end of rant. Let me know what you guys think, all right? The Neutral Corner is back Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're going to do a big preview of all the fights this weekend, including Fury Wallen. So join in on the fun right here on this channel, Thursday, 7 p.m. See you at the fights.